Good afternoon. We're about to commence the afternoon session of EA Festival, day 2. And I'm excited to introduce this session because it's about Hong Kong. And I lived in Hong Kong for over 20 years. And recently I read this book. And I literally, after 400 pages, which went like a glass of water, I put it down and I thought, oh my God, I've got to get in touch with this author, because I really thought it was the best possible account of Hong Kong because of how thoroughly researched and beautifully written it is. And by the way, of course, it's on sale at Red Lion Books and available to be signed by Michael Sheridan, the author, after this session. Michael was a foreign correspondent for Reuters, then The Independent, before becoming the Far East correspondent for the Sunday Times, a stint which kept him in Asia from 1996 to 2016. Meaning that if he was able to witness firsthand a lot of the events which he describes in his book. When he returned to Europe recently, he became the Sunday Times' Paris correspondent, but put reporting on hold in order to write this book. This book has been chosen by Ming Pao, the leading Chinese newspaper in Hong Kong, as its book of the year, actually, which is a huge distinction, but also possibly ambivalent in the minds of some of you, because this is, I would describe this as a political history written from the standpoint of China. And on that note, I am going to ask Michael the first question, which is, why did you write this book? What were the professional and personal circumstances which led you to write this book? And why write a book from the standpoint of China?
I wanted to write a book that was history and not journalism. There are many brilliant journalistic books about China, but I didn't want to add to the stack. I also thought very carefully about what I was qualified to write, and I did that because I was there. I saw most of the things that happened, met all the people involved. And when I put the book up to HarperCollins in 2016, 2017, wasn't an evident dramatic climax to the story of Hong Kong. So it was a hard sell and started out as a quasi-academic book. Then I talked it through, events moved on. It was very clear that we were missing half the story. We've all steeped ourselves in the literature written by Westerners about Hong Kong and China, some of it absolutely brilliant. What was missing was the Chinese side. And I think this is the sort of golden rule that one absorbed from studying history at university, which is that just because you don't like the other side doesn't excuse you from finding out what they actually said and did and thought. So I would say this is not written from the Chinese standpoint. It is written from a perspective that takes into account how both sets of people interpreted the events. And by the way, the millions of people marching in the streets of Hong Kong for democracy and opposed to the Chinese government are in fact Chinese.
Excellent point. Now, because we want to give you some background to this talk, because not all of you lived in Hong Kong, and even if you did, it's unlikely that you know that its history like the back of your hand. So, Michael, I want you to give a quick thumbnail chronology of Hong Kong as best as you can, so that all of you in the audience can get a handle on the questions that I'm going to ask later.
The potted version, the exam viva question, is that Hong Kong was created because of trade and commerce, not because of military expansion. It was founded around about 1840 to 42. The reason was that the British traders had in essence been expelled from southern China. They occupied the harbour of Hong Kong initially. There then occurred the first so-called Opium War between Britain and China. A treaty was signed in 1842 granting Britain sovereignty in perpetuity over Hong Kong Island. During the 1860s, there was a further sequence of wars, essentially the Western powers forcing open the door to China, to open it up to trade and joining the international system which was coming into being. There was a second war, which Douglas Hurd wrote a rather good short book about called the Arrow War. The second treaty gave the tip of Kowloon and a stretch of territory to Britain in perpetuity. So there were two international treaties which gave us Hong Kong Island and a small part of the mainland. At the end of the century, a further sequence of wars and disasters for China ended in a series of agreements with the foreign powers, and under the so-called Second Convention of Beijing, Britain obtained a lease for 99 years over the bulk of the territories that we see on the map as Hong Kong today. That remained intact, astonishingly, through great turbulence in China, the fall of the dynasty, the rise of the Kuomintang, the start of the Chinese Civil War. It was brought to an end by the Japanese conquest in 1941 when they took the entire territory. The British returned in 1945 after a tussle between Churchill, Roosevelt and Chiang Kai-shek. There was some question as to whether we would get back in, but we did. Then the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949.
Don't
Millions
forget
of people,
1946, the Young Plan.
yes,
this is important.
the Chinese Civil War ended with the victory of the communists. At the time, the returning colonial government, led by Sir Mark Young, who was an extraordinary public servant, experimented with the idea of bringing democracy and self-rule to the people of Hong Kong. And Mark Young argued that this would actually reinforce British authority over the colony because it would make government participatory. Anyway, this plan was interred by Whitehall, forgotten by successive Labour governments as well as Conservative ones. And Hong Kong, as we all know, embarked on this remarkable boom expansion through the years when China was closed, when it profited in one way, and the years when China began to open up, when it profited in another. Things came to a head in the early 1980s because the lease was expiring on the new territories, and propelled by commercial and legal imperatives, the governor sought clarity. People needed to know what was going to happen to the land leases. So Britain was obliged to open negotiations with China. Those negotiations began in 1982, led by Mrs. Thatcher initially. It took 2 years to reach an agreement, the joint declaration, under which the famous formula of one country but two systems was established, and China agreed that Hong Kong would continue with its way of life and its systems intact for 50 years after the handover. Last two episodes, things sailed along quite well during the 1980s until June 4th, 1989, when the Chinese government sent in the tanks to Tiananmen Square, killed an awful lot of its own citizens. It became clear that Hong Kong could not simply coast to the handover. So we sent out Chris Patten with a mandate to democratize and reform. That succeeded as far as it went until the handover in 1997, when the Chinese, as they had warned, abolished all these democratic institutions and reduced political life. There then obtained about a decade of calm. And Chris Patten himself will tell you that he thought it was going quite well, despite various crises and demonstrations and the SARS epidemic of 2003, until Xi Jinping came to power. That changed the nature of government in China. It made them adopt a much harder policy towards Hong Kong. It triggered the mass violent protests of 2019. There followed the imposition of a national security law in 2020. That law essentially brings Hong Kong under the vague but absolutist powers that reign over the rest of China. So I think the end of the story as we now see it is that Hong Kong is now another Chinese city.
Now, I want to also clarify a couple historical points because they're central to our discussion. What was the actual content of the joint declaration negotiated by Thatcher and concluded in 1984? Because it was subsequently vitiated by Chris Patten's actions, according to your book. But anyway, let's actually first unpack what were the terms of that joint declaration for the benefit of everybody?
It's not actually a very long document,
Yes.
but there are two bits of it that really matter. One is the commitment that Hong Kong's way of life would continue after 1997, with specific references to rights and freedoms, and indeed international obligations that were enshrined in treaties to which Hong Kong and the British government were parties. And the critical word, which David Wilson, the penultimate governor of Hong Kong, was involved in negotiating, was that the Chinese agreed, after much high-level haggling, to insert the word elections in the joint declaration, which then stated that the future leader of Hong Kong could be chosen local consultation and elections. That was the crucial word. There was then a great debate about what did that mean, because an election in China means one thing and an election in Hong Kong, the rest of the world, means another. But that was the key point. People here who know Hong Kong will know that the joint declaration was then converted into a kind of basic constitution called the Basic Law, which is the Chinese document which repeats most of those commitments, but adds substantial caveats which essentially give China free rein to do what it will.
Now, what do you think about my comment about me saying that because, and we talked about this, possibly when I read your book, my sense of Chris Patten's actions was that he was a bit of a bull in the china shop, and took actions which basically led to the, the cancellation or the vitiation of the joint declaration originally agreed by Thatcher, which was in and of itself a kind of triumph. So, but let me see where we should start, because this is not an easy topic to unpack fluidly. Now, first, about the joint declaration, what is so interesting about the book is also how it depicts the characters who were involved and how they dealt with the power dynamics. And what I took away from it is that the joint declaration was actually a kind of victory for Margaret Thatcher, because Deng Xiaoping could have easily just walked away from the bargaining table. And to quote from the book, he did say to her, ostensibly, based on translator's observation, or other, I don't remember, well, you're going to unpack this, but that Deng Xiaoping at that moment, when the first time he met Margaret Thatcher, said, you know what, I could take it all away right now. So with that as a starting point of their negotiation, the joint declaration could be considered a kind of triumph.
Well, a trigger warning for sensitive members of the audience. I am now going to say something nice about Mrs. Thatcher.
This is a very pro-Thatcher audience,
okay,
Michael.
That's fine.
Don't worry.
I spent a lot of time in the Thatcher archives in Churchill College, Cambridge. Not merely her government papers, but her personal papers. She kept everything. Menu cards, airline stubs, seating plans, all manner of private documents. She scribbled down things, personal notes that she sent to Percy Craddock and other members of her team. She was a formidable architect of the joint declaration. She writes to Ronald Reagan at the end of the process saying, I do not pretend this is a perfect declaration, but I think it is a good one. So she compromised, and that word elections was very important. What was more important, I think, in her mind was getting China to agree to transfer Hong Kong through a treaty and not simply exercising raw power and taking it back. I mean, these are events with resonances today, obviously. She showed that personality matters. It isn't just vague Marxist waves of events. She walked in to meet Deng Xiaoping in September 1982. The wisdom was that we had no cards to play. In fact, we had substantial cards to play because China was weak, it was beleaguered, it needed to open up. And she really gave a masterclass in how does a power deal from a position of weakness with a dictatorship whose authority is more or less absolute and can do what it wants. You always have some leverage and you have some cards to play. So Deng is sitting there. There is a spittoon on the floor between him and Mrs. Thatcher, and her black handbag is on the other side of the table. The spittoon was used more frequently than the handbag. And he does say, the Downing Street transcript is a bit blander, but there's no doubt of a change in tone. And he says, look, these treaties, we don't recognise them, and we can take it back. And we're going to take it all back in 1997. And she recovers her poise. And this is the sort of, she was legally trained, of course, and honed at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. And she recovers her poise, and she says back to him, you could do that, but China would pay a very high price. And this are the reasons why we think we should reach an agreement. Now, there is a debate because later in the day, she gilded the lily somewhat and said he could walk in and take it in an afternoon. I found the young British diplomat who was in the room taking the notes, who was a fluent Chinese speaker, Bob Pearce. He doesn't remember that phrase being used. So she wasn't above, dramatising for effect in hindsight. But the point was there. And the people of Hong Kong were pawns in this. They were sacrificed on one level because the overpowering need for Britain and China was to reach an agreement. Think of it, the height of the Cold War, nuclear standoff, the world held together by skeins of international treaties and agreements on which survival depended. So if a major power had simply broken 2 international treaties and seized a piece of land, this was the Prime Minister who had gone to fight for the Falklands. And there were cities like Berlin, for example, that also depended for their existence on international agreements. So it was a very big picture. And it is to her credit that she saw the big picture. But I'll give you 3 very quick takeaways from reading a great deal in her papers and her private letters and her notes to her. She was absolutely across the detail. She immersed herself in it. She didn't miss anything. She even vetoed the menu on the plane out to China because the RAF wanted to serve caviar. And she put an X and said, no, far too expensive. And the next moment she's moving on to high matters of state. So she's absolutely across the detail. The second thing is that she did have a moral core. Not everybody may have liked Mrs. Thatcher or agreed with her philosophy, but she certainly had one, and she had strong moral beliefs about our responsibilities to Hong Kong. And the third thing was that when she was faced with a very hard decision, she did not shirk it. She took that decision. So those 3 things, mastery of detail, moral core, ability to take hard decisions. Comment with regard to today would be completely superfluous, wouldn't it?
Okay, so that was actually a diplomatic triumph, and also conducted by her emissaries, Percy Craddock and David Wilson. And then let's fast forward to Chris Patten being installed as the governor of Hong Kong. Describe those events and how you depicted them in your book, but also in your own words now.
Well, I've just finished reading Chris Patten's diaries, which are out next week, to review them for the Sunday Times, and was forced to revisit in agonizing day-by-day detail all this incredibly difficult, intricate negotiation about long-forgotten constitutional arrangements and so on. Patten arrives in 1992. Hong Kong is still in shock. David Wilson, the governor, was an eminent sinologist, first-class public servant, steadied Hong Kong after the Tiananmen massacre, but he knew it was time to go. You could say he was eased out, but Wilson himself has said to me he knew that at the handover, Britain needed a politician, somebody with broad shoulders. He would have liked to have seen a Hong Kong person in the role. As the cards fell, Chris Patten went out in 1992 with a mandate from the cabinet to bring more democracy to Hong Kong so that we could hand it over, as we thought, in a better state to stand up for itself and thrive inside China. Naturally, the Chinese opposed this. I will spare everyone the detail, but essentially, Patten's line is that he sought, without breaking the letter of the joint declaration, to expand the vote bring more democracy, open up government, give the democratic voices in Hong Kong a chance to flourish. Let's not forget, it was the people of Hong Kong who were demanding more representation. There were 1 million people in the streets on June the 5th, 1989. I was there. Nobody forced them to come out into the streets. So there was enormous political and moral pressure on Britain to do something. Did Patten handle it well? Difficult. He went to Beijing.
Was it an impossible task, I guess? I mean, can you imagine a better, I mean, he announced it as a fait accompli to the Chinese government instead of following 20 years of diplomatic precedent where the Chinese were always consulted well in advance in numerous rounds of previous negotiation preceding any kind of major agreement. And so that was already a non-starter. But is there any chance that the outcome could have been different had they been consulted? Or, I mean, how much blame do we have to lay at his door for being ham-fisted or being a bull in a china shop? Was it his style? Was there any possibility of that?
Well, Douglas Hurd, who was definitely not a bull in a china shop and not a rash person, says in his own memoirs that the problem was that the Chinese essentially wanted us to go back to the old days of completely secret negotiations, understandings reached in private, side letters, a whole way of doing business that John Major and Hurd considered politically impossible after 1989. Now, there is a subtle argument by people like David Wilson, who has been extremely graceful about his successor and has never said a bad word about him, that you could have continued on a graduated path with China. There was an agreement to increase the number of elected seats. You could have sought to reinforce that in various ways. The way it was done was clumsy, certainly. But what are the options? And do remember, we all got China wrong at that point. In the early 1990s, and when I arrived back in Hong Kong in 1996, the journalists all thought the regime would collapse. The governments and the corporations all thought the regime would liberalize as it got richer. We were both wrong, and China has confounded both those principles. So it's quite hard to look back in hindsight and say that one way or another would have produced a better result.
Now, you spend an entire chapter of your book on Percy Craddock, and I wanted to know, I was wondering why you sought to, I would say, rehabilitate his image as an appeaser or somebody who was basically a walkover.
Well, Sir Percy Craddock was the man from John le Carré who you've never heard of in most cases. He was a remarkable civil servant. He was ambassador to China, subsequently foreign policy advisor in Downing Street throughout the remainder of the Thatcher years. He continued in that role under John Major. He was also chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee, which makes him the spy supremo in journalese. So he had the highest security clearance in the land. And he was steeped in China. He wrote a very elegant memoir of his time there in which he said that China was an acquired taste, most of it bitter. He devised the tactics of negotiating with the Chinese. He had endless patience. He was captivated by China even though he was repelled by it. He says in a private letter I found that no one has ever said the Chinese are not intolerable and impossible. They always have been. So he was not a China appeaser, a China lover, but he was a very cold realist. So I was quite fascinated by this man. I spoke to him once in the 1990s. He didn't like the media. He didn't believe in giving interviews. So he was an enigmatic figure. And it was David Wilson who told me that his private papers had been left to St. John's College, Cambridge. And there they lay. Boxes and boxes of them, a treasure trove of stuff in Chinese and English, personal letters from high-level figures in China, photographs, memoirs, private correspondence, fascinating exchange of letters with Lee Kuan Yew about power and China and all that kind of thing. And in those letters, I found that a great deal of material that changed my mind about him. And I think you start writing history, you have to be more open-minded than you were. If you're going to write a newspaper column, you take a thesis and you pound it to heaven until you've demonstrated it you're going to write a history, you want to try and see all sides of it, as I say, not to agree, but to understand. So what emerges in the Craddock Papers is a much more nuanced picture of a man who was a very bleak realist in international affairs, but he believed that he'd got the best deal for the people of Hong Kong and that the bargain struck with China would endure and that the Chinese could be trusted to keep their word. He also was extremely down-to-earth and realistic about strategy and politics and what happened next. And I found an extraordinary letter from him to John Major warning that if Patten went ahead with his reforms, the results would be worse, not better. And I put this to Patten when I interviewed him for the book, and I pointed out that if you look at this 6-page typed letter, everything which Percy Craddock predicted has come to pass. And of course, Chris is very defensive about this, as he might well be. And he has a reasoned argument. And I think to try to be fair to both of them, you could summon it up by saying that Percy Craddock was accurate, but quite possibly Chris Patten was right in that you had to try. You couldn't just hand the people of Hong Kong over. And the endeavour failed, let's face it.
Now, on that, and then we're going to have to take questions quite soon. Considering the backdrop of realpolitik, where at no time did China actually, were its intentions unclear, except that the Western media and some politicians insisted on depicting a more rosy situation and the potential for democracy in China. Would you say that the protests in Hong Kong were inevitable for simple reasons such as the polarization of wealth, intergenerational change, after Tiananmen, basically, and just like the transparency of information? I mean, what is your, based on all that you have studied and researched in this book, I mean, was it inevitable that that was going to happen no matter, just because of the handover?
One thing we did for the book, and I'm speaking about my marvellous researchers in China who regrettably have to remain unacknowledged, we did dig into the Chinese side. There are 5 memoirs written by prominent people on the Chinese side of the negotiations. We read them all. Copious documentation in the provincial archives in Guangdong. Through that comes a burning feeling of pride and patriotism and revenge, and a great impetus to put an end to this chapter of colonialism. I think that was forefront in their minds to the extent that they kind of forgot about the people in Hong Kong and what they might actually think. So you were left with a situation where ordinary people in Hong Kong were expected to revel in being Chinese and embrace their new identity. But politics happen. And the protests which broke out in 2014 and 2019, may I point out, were not that different from other protests occurring around the globe in similar ways. I was sitting in Cambridge doing the research for the book and spent an evening with the local members of Extinction Rebellion who were in contact with the students in Hong Kong and comparing WhatsApp tactics and how you organise a flash mob and things like that. So these were kind of global movements at the time, and Hong Kong got caught up in them because they could. People could demonstrate, they could go out and march. But China had always warned, Deng Xiaoping warned directly that if there was serious disorder, they would crack down and they would take over. And that is what they have done.
The reason I ask is because also you depict the transition of Macau from Portuguese to Chinese sovereignty. And that was a relatively just very smooth and supine transition. Could that ever have happened in Hong Kong? That was where the basis of my question came from.
There's a very smooth and elegant memoir by a Portuguese diplomat who helped negotiate the transition of Macau, who's sadly no longer with us, but he reminded of several key differences. One was that the Portuguese government essentially abandoned its effort to control Macau in the 1970s, moved to a revolutionary left-wing government. They tried to give it back to China. Then the Portuguese dug in their heels a bit over their own declaration with China. They delayed it by 2 years because the Chinese wanted to choreograph everything. And the Portuguese also won recognition for citizenship for their nationals in Macau, which is a key difference from Hong Kong. So the outcome was different. It's a smaller territory, different history, different politics in the colonizing nation. I don't think the comparison works, to be honest.
No, I'm alluding to the too little, too late policy of Chris Patten to give a tantalizing taste of democracy, or the promise of one, to the Hong Kong people right before the handover. And sometimes that is blamed for the unrest which followed.
Well, remember, he was attacked by the Democrats, by Martin Lee and Emily Lau and other dear and wonderful people for giving too little.
But did he open
too
a
late.
Pandora's box, is what I'm asking.
Well, there's plenty of disorder in China. Riots, strikes, demonstrations, punch-ups. Look at what happened in Xinjiang in this century. Before the present clampdown, democracies have no monopoly on disorder. There's an awful lot of disorder in China.
Now coming to now, and the inevitable question at the end of such an interview is, so what's next for China in the sense of, is the style of governance, diplomacy, essentially the same? I mean, you have some very interesting observations, which aren't even necessarily in the book on this subject, so share those with us.
At the end of the book, one tries to take a reckoning of accounts, and the key event is, of course, the access to power of Xi Jinping in 2012, 2013. There's no question that China operates under a much stronger government than it had 10, 20 years ago. Power of the state has re-expanded and occupied the spaces abandoned at the end of Maoism. I think for all our wishful thinking, which is what informs the West a bit too much, I don't see any evidence of change. I read all the speculation about Xi Jinping and the leadership. It would be delightful to think of it all happening, but I don't think it will, because we have no evidence for it. I think they can do zero COVID. They have the power to enforce that. They can look at an economic recovery in the autumn to coincide with important political meetings. They will vaccinate large numbers of their older population over the summer. I think they can get through this, and I think that Xi Jinping shows every sign of remaining in power, healthy and effective for the foreseeable future.
Would you say that Xi Jinping's leadership is just a continuation of Deng Xiaoping's, or has anything changed fundamentally in how the CCP is actually conducting itself? Or is it just
Absolutely.
the same? And are a lot of the lessons which are shared in your book, would you say they apply now in the style of...
Radical change in China. Under Deng Xiaoping and after Mao, China evolved a more collective form of leadership. Chris Patten always used to joke that at his most powerful, Deng occupied no public office apart from being head of the All China Bridge Federation. And you saw this kind of collective, factional leadership achieving balance at the top. And Xi Jinping tore up the rule book. You know, he threw his rivals into jail. He's purged hundreds of thousands of people, including military officers. His principal political influence, as far as I can judge, is a man called Wang Huning, who's a sort of cheap philosopher from Fudan University, who read Samuel Huntington and thought he'd discovered the elixir of political theory. Nobody claims, including Xi, that he's an intellectual. His propagandists have made that out. He's there for life, however long life is, because I cannot see an exit ramp. If you've done the things he has done, there is no quiet retirement in Beidou. So that's where you are.
Okay, so return to the cult of the personality. Now, before I turn to the audience for questions, I wanted to ask about your prognosis for and the effect of current events, Ukraine specifically, on China's thinking in regard to Taiwan, because it's also a big national wound and an affront to their sovereignty, which an important comparison was drawn in your book to Hong Kong. So what is your take on that?
Deng Xiaoping was very patient. He never thought that you could achieve reunification with Taiwan quickly. They invented one country, two systems for Taiwan. Then they realized Taiwan wasn't going to happen anytime soon, so they adapted it for Hong Kong. Wise heads in China are prepared to be patient and persuade the people of Taiwan that one day they might reunify. I can't see that a conflict could possibly be in China's interests. It might be in Xi Jinping's interests if things look dodgy for him, but there is no way that all the incredibly admirable achievements of the Chinese people in the last 40 years should be jeopardized by an adventure in the Taiwan Strait. I mean, to sum it up, I would guess, talking to people in Taipei quite recently, I think Taiwan is actually a lot safer than it was 4 months ago.
Unpack that a little bit for the
Well,
audience.
because the Chinese have seen the power of the Western financial system and the sanctions applied to Russia. They have seen the enormous damage that can be done. I do not believe all communists are bad people and that all communist leaders are merely gangsters. You know, there are people in China who want the development and progress of the country and the benefit of the people. And it would be a calamitous miscalculation. But dictatorships make miscalculations. Saddam Hussein, Kuwait, 1990, that's the textbook example. You can't imagine that Xi Jinping could take a rash decision by himself. There are institutional brakes on him. And I would be reasonably sanguine about the outcome at the moment. They don't want this to happen.
I mean, in short,
them.
it's unlikely there'll be a Vladimir Putin moment.
Yeah.
On that note, we'd like to take questions from the audience. This gentleman.
Thank you. Broader question. You might be able to summarize Xi Jinping's general approach as being make China great again, like that other one. What does China being great look like for the rest of us? What do you think they think it looks like? Is it like it was in 1540 and so on?
Well, he certainly wants to make the world safe for authoritarianism and to make sure that his governing system survives. Chinese historians and propagandists are generally quite correct when they say that historically China has not been an expansionist power. It has absorbed and tried to dominate countries on its periphery. All the people I talked to in China over 20 years, and I'm including longer than that, students at Shanghai University in June 1989, their vision of China was a country recovering its greatness and prospering as it had done. As many of you will know, Chinese intellectuals speak of the Ming Dynasty as the height of the cultural superiority and achievement, the time of riches and comfort and trade. A really great China would be all those things. The attempt to expand Chinese power militarily is, potentially pretty limited. What Wang Huning, Xi Jinping's philosopher, talks about is cultural hegemony and cultural sovereignty. And that means the expansion of values. So conquest doesn't mean territory or ports or markets. It can also mean values, which I think is why we have to be very vigilant now and realize that we're up against something that is qualitatively different from the kind of conflict that occurred in the Cold War.
Charles. This is
There's been quite a lot in the press in the last few months about the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong. Under the Basic Law, the fifth member of the Court of Final Appeal should be from a Commonwealth country. How do you think that is going to play out?
As you know, the strength of the Hong Kong legal system is one of the bulwarks of the place's existence, and the idea of having Commonwealth judges on the Court of Final Appeal was to add legitimacy and balance. Unfortunately, John Lee, the policeman who has now taken over as the head of Hong Kong, has specifically said that having foreign judges on the courts enhances the legitimacy of the legal system and confers an authority on it which would otherwise be absent. And frankly, this is now a dilemma. And for example, I've studied the writings and remarks of Jonathan Sumption, for who I have enormous admiration, not least as a medieval historian. But I think he's wrong on this one. I think we're reaching the point where, there are hundreds of people in jail. The courts are, the magistrates' courts in particular, are a charade. They're operating as they would in mainland China. I think we have reached the point, alas, where the presence of foreign judges on the court is no longer desirable, and I think they should make their calculations accordingly.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. I was a short-term resident in Hong Kong in 1989, 1990, and I worked for a Hong Kong-based company all of my career. I now find myself working for China's largest investment bank. I think you're right in terms of Hong Kong's future, that it's just going to become another Chinese city, part of the greater Bay Area development in southern China. And I think that from an aspect of thinking about China, investing in China, Xi has been a very sort of controversial and unknown figure initially, but since the corruption clampdown in 2013, 2014, the power, the grab for power within the party has been pretty absolute. And as you say, I don't think there's any change in direction. But there's a cost to this, because the challenge that China is posing to the current hegemon America, has resulted in increased geopolitical friction between America and China, trade restrictions, etc. So what is Xi Jinping's end game here? Is it just to be the leader of an all-powerful communist party in an isolated China from the rest of the world, with a good friend called Vladimir? Or does China, to progress long-term, want to be part of the global community?
When I was a very young reporter in the Middle East, I once asked a British ambassador in a ghastly Middle Eastern country, I said, what is the policy of the regime? And he said, the policy of the regime is to stay in power. That, I think, explains where Xi Jinping is at. I think you can still make a lot of money in Hong Kong. I think you can still make a lot of money in China. The Chinese government is intent on making Hong Kong its international financial centre, but on its own terms. You're going to see a substantial inflow of funds to the stock market. You're going to see, I think, as they achieve stabilisation, as they regard it, they will commit more funds to further infrastructure development. They're going to grow the Greater Bay Area. But all these things will come at the cost of understanding that you are operating under a completely different system. And that, with every respect to the judicial system, it's very hard to see how the courts are going to arbitrate commercial disputes fairly in future. What are they going to do if an international investment bank is litigating against a major Chinese state-owned entity? Very difficult to see how that continues. So I think, peace and prosperity can possibly be guaranteed, but you will operate under different rules. And that is the way it is. And what happens in Hong Kong depends on what happens in Beijing. And frankly, we don't know about that.
Okay. On that fascinating but grim
I can tell a few more
and
jokes.
unbelievably enlightening note that goes for the entire session. Michael is available to sign copies of his book at Red Lion Books, and I really can't recommend this book enough. Also because I think it sheds light on the future, and if you want to gain a better understanding of just China, I think this is really that. There are very few books which are as good as this one. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.